It is a great pleasure to be here with all of you tonight, and we are going to have a conversation about Paul's work and especially about his latest novel, Grace, which just came out in France and which was distinguished in Ireland with the Irish Book of the Year by the Kerry Group and wonderful reviews in the United States, the UK, in Ireland, of course. And I think it would be great if we could start with your voice leading us into this world that we are going to enter.
A reading.
Absolutely.
I have to say it's really wonderful to be here and to see all these faces. Thank you so much for coming out. If you hear a small child wailing down the back, that would be my 4-year-old son, 4-month-old son. So we won't send him out to the yard. I'm going to read from the opening of Grace. It doesn't really need much of an introduction, but we are at the Samhain of 1845, which is a seminal moment in Irish history. Not the doors to the underworld are opening for a single night, but also the doors to an underworld for the country are beginning to open. This flood October, and in the early light, her mother goes for her, rips her from sleep, takes her from a dream of the world. She finds herself arm-hauled across the room, panic shot loose to the blood. She thinks, do not shout and stir the others. Do not let them see Mam like this. She cannot sound out anyhow. Her mouth is thick and tonguing shock, so it is her shoulder that speaks. It cracks aloud in protest, sounds as if her arm were rotten, a branch from a tree snapped clean. From a place that is speechless comes the recognition that something in the making up of her world has been unfixed. She is drawn to the exit as if harnessed to her mother. Her body bent like a buckling field implement, her feet blunt blades, a knife cut of light by the door. Her eyes fight the gloom to get a fasten on her mother, see just a hand pale as bone viced upon her wrist. She swings her free fist, misses, swings at the dark, at the air complicit, digs her heels into the floor. Will against will she pits, though Sarah's will now has become more like animal power, as secret strength she thinks, like Neely Ford's ox before he killed it and left. And now her wrist burns in her mother's grip. She rolls from her heels to her toes as she is dragged out the door. What comes to meet them is a smacking cold as if it has lurked there just for them, an animal thing eager in the dawn, a morning that sits low and crude and grey. Not yet the true cold of winter, though the trees huddle like old men stripped for punishment and the land is haggard just waiting. The trees here are mountain ash, but bear not the limbs of grace. They stand foreshortened and twisted as if they could find no succor in the shallow earth, were stunted by the skies ever low. Beneath them pass Sarah and her daughter, this girl pale-skinned, 14, still boy-chested, her long hair set loose in her face so that all her mother can see of her are the girl's teeth set to grimace. Her mother force-sits her on the killing stump. Sit you down on it, she says. It seems for a moment that a vast silence has opened. The wind, a restless wanderer, all times at this height is still. The rocks set into the mountain are great teeth clamped shut to listen. In the mud puddles, the girl is witness to herself, sees the woman's warp standing over her grey and grotesque. The spell of silence breaks. Wing flap and whoosh of a dark bird that shoots overhead for the hill. She thinks, what has become of Mam while I slept? Who has taken her place? Of a sudden she sees what the heart fears most, pulled from out of her mother's skirt, the dulled knife. And then out of her own dark comes her brother Collie's story, his huge eyes all earnest, the story of a family so hard up they put the knife to the youngest. Or was it the eldest, she thinks? Collie, always with the stories, always yammering on, swearing on his life it was true. Quit your fooling, she said then. But now she knows that one thing leads to another, and something has led to this. She hears Sarah wheezing behind her, hears the youngers creep open the door to peep. She thinks of the last living thing they saw put to blood, the unfurling of the goose into arcing white as it was chased, rupturing the air with shrill, the eerie calm of that bird with its long neck to the stump, and their sister quiet now just like it, the same blunt knife that made such long work, and Boggs that time waiting, the way he picked them clean. She sees the blade come up, becomes an animal that bucks and braces against her mother. The rush of Collie then, this small bull of a boy, 12 years old, his cap falling off, yelling out his sister's name, Grace. She hears in his voice some awful desperation, as if to speak her name is to save it from the closure of meaning, that as long as he is sounding it, no harm can be done. She feels the swerve towards an oncoming dark, Collie tugging at his mother, the way he gets an arm around Sarah's waist until she makes light work of him, puts him to the ground. Then she speaks, and her voice is shaking. Collie, get you back into the house. Grace turns and sees her brother red-cheeked upon his sit-bones, sees the knife in her mother's hand as if she were embarrassed of it. Eye to eye they meet, and she is surprised by what she does not see in her mother, any sign of madness or evil. Hears when the woman speaks, a knot twisting in the cords of her throat. Enough, please, would ye? Then Sarah moves quick, takes a fist of the girl's hair to lay bare the porcelain of her throat, brings up the knife. All the things you can see in a moment. She thinks there is truth after all to Collie's story. She thinks the last you will see of Mam is her shadow. She thinks, take with you a memory of all this. A sob loosens from the deepest part and sings itself out. What she meets is the autumn of her long hair. It falls in swoons, falls a glittering of evening colours, her hair spun with failing sunlight. She sobs at the pain in her scalp as her mother yanks and cuts, sobs as her hair falls in ribbons, her eyes close to their inner stars. When she opens them again, her mother has circled her, Collie on his knees holding fistfuls of hair, the wind cold licking bitter at her bare neck. She raises her hands and puts them dumb to what's left of her head, her mother stepping in front of her, the knife going into the dress. Sarah looks frustrated, breathless, wan and exhausted, the skin on her throat beginning to hang loose, as if to wear it well requires effort she has not within her. Her collarbone a brooch of banished beauty. She rests her hands on her 7th-month swell, bowls up her voice to her daughter. What she says, you are the strong one now. There we are.
Grace is your third novel after Red Sky in the Morning and The Black Snow. And all three books share two things, and I would like us maybe to talk about these two things. These two things are, first of all, your three novels so far are set in the past, and I think it would be interesting for you to tell us what is so interesting in the past for a writer, and how can you make it so present as well. And all three books share also the same place, which is Donegal. And I would like us to tell you first, we have been introduced to a character. She's 14 year old. Her name is Grace, and she's a character in a very specific moment of your country's history. Could you tell us a little bit what was the inspiration at first for going back to the 19th century after having written Red Sky?
So, when talking about a novel, I should sort of be clear that everything is really rationalization after the fact. That often I don't quite know what exactly I'm doing at all. And, you know, the novels are set in Donegal, and Grace is a character who has a history, that she's the daughter of Cathal Coyle from the first novel, Red Sky and Morning. And so I should talk about Red Sky and Morning a little bit first, because that's when I discovered I had to go back to Donegal, because when I grew up in Donegal and I left to go to Dublin when I was 18. And I mean, I literally fled the place. I mean, you couldn't have got me out of Donegal quicker. You know, I was done with it, and but it turns out that Donegal was not done with me. And there he goes on cue. But what I discovered was when I first started writing fiction, that, well, I got the call of a novel. I got the call of Red Sky and Morning. And what I mean by a call is that it's this inchoate feeling inside you. A book comes from a place of feeling. It's not something you conceptualize before writing it. It comes from very deep in your subconscious, and you live with a feeling inside you. And the book exists because you need to exercise this feeling. This is how I work. I fill up with this thing, and then I know I need to write the book. And I didn't want to write the first novel to set it in Donegal, but I realized I had to. And that's perhaps the first lesson I learned as a writer, is that you don't choose your novels, and that if there's a reason why you don't want to do it, that's usually the reason why you have to do it. And what I learned by going back to Donegal was that the landscape that I despised as a child, as a teenager, the rolling boglands, the mountains, that they began to speak to me in a completely different way on the page. That their timelessness, the evocation of an ancient past began to come through the language for me. And I could feel that the Donegal landscape offered me an arena of timelessness where I could create kind of mythological or historical settings that would essentially be timeless. That I want to set my fiction in such a way that it can operate in the present, if you wanted to, in the past, or in the deep past. And so, like a book like Grace, I get asked all the time now. You know, it seems to have resonances with what's happening in Syria, and this is what happens when you write historical fiction. That you're creating a refraction. You're distilling. You're distilling life. You're moving away from the noise of the present, and you're seeking the signal, the things that matter to us fundamentally as within the human condition. And so historical novels, I won't use the term historical fiction because I despise it, but novels set in the historical past allow you to write about the contemporary moment through refraction. They also allow you to write about the moment that it is ostensibly about, in this case, the Irish famine. And then there's just the resonances underneath it. And that's what I found. And so Grace arrived in much the same way. This 14-year-old girl began with this, like, she quivered inside me like a plucked string. That's the only way I can describe it. I had no idea who she was. I had no idea what I had on my hands. But I sat down to write that first page, and I started writing that scene, and I realized that this girl had a mother, but there was no father, and that she had a brother, and he was 2 years younger than her, and that she was 14, probably going on 15 soon, and a little bit of counting, and I realized that this was called Coil's family. So immediately I said, okay, well, I'm not doing this book, because I did not want to go back to 19th century Ireland. And as I say, she's 14, so going on 15, so it had to be 1845. So it was like, okay, now I'm taking on a famine novel as well as doing a bloody sequel. So I said no. And what was worse was I had done an interview on the record with Arminta Wallace from the Irish Times, where she asked me that question: would I write a sequel to Red Sky and Morning? And I just laughed at the idea and said it will never happen. And there I was beginning this sequel, but Grace she just took over, and I had this enormous fear that why would you take on the famine as a subject? It's it's beyond the scope of any of us, and so that's one of the reasons why I didn't want to write this book.
So writing a book about such a period of time in Ireland's history, how did you proceed? Was it mostly feeling about that period, trying to imagine, documentation? What was the is this something that you felt, or is this something that you prepared?
Well, I was lucky in that when I had written Red Sky and Morning, I had already created a kind of a language or a sort of mythology of that period, my rendering of that period. And so I suspect that if I was to write Grace from scratch without having access to that sort of language, that it would have taken me longer than the 3.5 years it took me to write this book. It would have taken me another 2 years, I reckon, on top of that. But that sort of that language was there, so I could access that straight away. So I was able to build upon that. But there was the problem of the famine, which I wanted to understand in a very different way, because we're very comfortable dealing with the famine in the abstract, academically, looking at it through all the various interpretive lenses that we have. But there is a gap, I think, there for the novelist, because we don't have a lot of fiction on the famine, strangely, and I think I know why. It's that there is this enormous silence, that we don't have the voices, that we don't have the direct testimony from people who lived through it, or, I mean, if you lived through it, you didn't speak of it. Much like the soldiers from World War I, those who survived it didn't speak of it, and those who died took their stories to the grave. And so there is an enormous silence, and there is a folk history record where descendants spoke about it, but how they spoke about it was along the lines of, well, it didn't happen in this house and it didn't happen in this townland. So there's an act of disassociation from the famine. And so I had this, as I did the research, I realized that I wanted to really get inside that disassociation, to get inside the silence, because I think I really believe that the Irish carry inside us this transmitted feeling of self-loathing and anger about the famine. And I encountered this myself when I sat down to write the book, and I asked myself, why am I feeling this? Because, I mean, the famine it's this abstract piece of history to me, and yet I could feel it inside me, and that's a very important thing to recognize as a writer, is that's the sign that you need to investigate. And I think what I learned in the writing of this book was that that to survive an event like this, you have to do things that take you to the shadow, the darkness inside. That civilization is a very thin veneer, and that people who survived had to lie and to good man Elliot, they had to lie and steal and possibly kill, and so I needed as a writer to open this up to the bone. I wanted to go in all the way, And so, but I needed to do it with a character who was not a victim. This is the thing, that I wanted to eliminate the cliche of just the victim dying in the ditches. And I wanted to take somebody who would capture that feeling that we all have, which is that, well, I would survive an event like that. Of course I would, you know, and I wouldn't descend into what, you know, the unspeakable. But of course, Grace does, because that's what's required to survive, because survivors are rarely heroes. And so the book follows her trajectory from leaving home as a 14-year-old and dressing up as a boy and general kind of what I call light criminality, and then sliding into a much, much deeper place of criminality, and then surviving by a very, very, very small thread of luck, a miracle, in fact. And she comes out of that and the only thing that she can do is be penitent, that she becomes the penitent, and she loses her voice because she cannot comprehend what's happened to her. She cannot speak of it. She cannot understand her own guilt as a survivor. And so the journey in the book is this one of descent into the full underworld, into the unspeakable, and then take her back out into the light, into a place of grace where she learns to live again and to take on life.
Even if at first her mother wants to save her life. She wants her to live and to live as well.
Yeah, there's an ambiguity, like, you know, when the mother's cutting the hair off, you know, it seems she's sending her out on the road to work, because, you know, dressing her up as a boy, it makes sense. But there's also the what's hanging over is Boggs, this character of who's been sort of preying on them, and there's a suggestion that she's next. And so the act of sending her away is actually a gift. But it also begins this great fall from innocence. And so there's the line, is it the second sentence? Hold on now, I should know it by heart, and I do, but it's takes her from a dream of the world, that's the dream, that's the innocence, that's the childhood, and that's, you know, her mother brutally sends her out into adulthood. And so the book was conceived by me. I wanted it to be a coming of age novel, and I was thinking of books like Huckleberry Finn. I wanted to write that kind of a book that had that sweet innocence of adolescence within this enormous world of what I call cosmic and moral collapse, and watching these two things at work all the time. Because Grace, I mean, she just doesn't understand what's unfolding, because we might be able to contextualize it for her now, but how can she know what it is? Mm-hmm. She doesn't understand events, so she's just living through them moment by moment. And that's one of the things that you have to do writing historically, is you have to unlearn everything that you have absorbed to write a book like this. You have to sort of decontaminate yourself from all the historical interpretations, the layers of interpretations, because they're also subject to politics and to fads and interpretations. And also there's just the problem of, well, what, you know, there's what we know, and then there's what we think we know, because the past is an abyss, and nobody can truly know what it was like. And so I have to just strip out all that knowledge and just go back to Grace, the 14-year-old on the road, moving forward.
But she's not alone. And on top of a 14-year-old girl, you had a 12-year-old boy, two innocent creatures set on a dangerous path, because they are facing the end of the world, you know, and many children throughout the world do face the end of their world, you know, and a threat to their lives. What was your impulse in wanting them to test the boundaries of their own humanity? Because this is what the journey is about as well. It's not only about 1845 Ireland, it's also, you know, facing the worst one can face in a lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote from Dostoevsky that I really like, and it sort of sums up a lot of what my books are about in some way or other, and it's how much human being is in a human being. And that's something that deeply interests me, is that a lot of my books seem to be about people, ordinary people, thrust into an extraordinary moment where the deepest reaches of their personalities are explored. And I'm just fascinated by this as a writer. When you go into this territory, you start to map out in some way or other, in whatever small way I can, what I think of this thing we're all stuck in, which is the human condition. I mean, this old metaphysical problem of how do we explain or come to terms with life. And it's an old question, and there's been endless attempts at trying to figure this out. And for me, it's endlessly fascinating that life is it's finite, and we spend our lives trying to avoid suffering. That's what we do, and everything we do is built around this, and we seek dignity in our lives at all times. And so my characters are always trying to find a moment, trying to grasp their dignity within these enormous events that are unfolding. And I was lucky that Colley came into this novel, because he just exploded in from somewhere back there. I don't know where he came from. I didn't know he was there until he came, really running towards her to try and rescue his sister. And Colley was exactly what this book needed, because you can't go into this Dantean underworld without humor, without some kind of levity. And Colley is this. He's just a exuberant, humorous, punning, riddling 12-year-old boy who's constantly poking fun at his sister. And of course he wants to go away with her, but she won't let him. But then when she realizes she goes away, spends one night and she comes back for him, and he's waiting to go. And so they go on this journey. And soon after this, I encountered what I'd call a major novelistic problem. And I'm not going to ruin too much by telling you that something happens to Colley. And it's not good. And it's not good for Grace. And suddenly Colley's not in the novel. And I've just lost a major character. And I was really cross about this, because I didn't see that coming either. What happens? I'm not going to ruin it, because I think it's an important moment. But I was faced with this massive problem, and I said, okay, I'm just going to keep writing. I'm going to keep writing through this problem. Grace is on the road now. Off she goes. We'll just go with her. And what happened miraculously was he reappears, but he reappears as a voice in her head, disembodied. But she thinks he's real. She speaks to him as if he's with her, completely in physical form. Nobody else, of course, sees him, so they see her talking to him, and they're going, "Who are you talking to?" And but for Grace, he's real. And what I realized was that she needed him. She's 14 years old. She's lost her brother. That the trauma of that, the grief, the shame, because she was responsible for him. And so, in many respects, she can't allow him to be gone from her life. And so, it makes perfect sense for her to do this. And so then I had to deal with the technical issue of having a character who's not a character. A character who's completely disembodied. And then that allows for lots of moments of fun in the book, and misunderstandings, and also the presence of him, who's, as the younger brother, constantly poking fun at her, because as this world is darkening, and the famine is getting worse. I mean, she's still a 14-year-old girl. Life is going on, and she's going through her adolescence. She's going through puberty, and her body's changing, and she's trying to make sense of these bodily changes. And her 12-year-old disembodied brother is doing exactly what 12-year-old brothers usually do, is he's poking fun at her the whole time. And so it was I was lucky that he came back in the way that he did.
On her journey, Grace is going to meet quite a few people. How did these characters come to your mind? What was did you did you create them through research? Did you read a lot about the historical famine and what people did at the time, or did you want Grace to meet people who would test her limits and test her endurance?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a magpie really when I'm working, and characters come from everywhere. They come from the back of my mind. They come from photos. They come from just something I've seen. Sometimes I'll see somebody on the street. Somebody can be really interesting. I'll just watch them, and it gets recorded, and it comes back out later on the page. And I mean, everybody in some way or other in this book, for Grace, marks a particular point of development for her. Because it's a coming of age novel, so she seems to have this amazing intuitive ability to pull people into her life at the moment that she really needs them. And so she ends up, for example, on a cattle bully, which is, essentially moving a large amount of cattle from one part of one county to another, by a land grabber or a cattle grabber, somebody who's buying cattle at a very low price because of the famine. But she gets mistaken for a boy, and it's perfect because, she needs to be making some money. She needs to be getting some food. And there are other characters. So, for example, the character of Bart, who becomes a very important character in this book, he came from a photograph. I think it was an American, a 19th century American photograph of a street criminal he had a withered hand and this amazing moustache and just something in his eyes that was just incredible in the photograph. And the second I saw this photo, it just boom, there was a character, and I knew who he was, and I knew they were going to meet. And so I had his photograph in my files waiting. I was just looking at this photo going, okay, we're getting to you soon. And that then began a kind of a somewhat love affair, because it's because they're still young and it's never quite consummated, and she doesn't know if she loves him or not, and it leads to all sorts of complications. And so that's one of the things, and there's that the book sort of has a love story. It has the qualities of an adventure story sometimes. It's a coming of age story. All these different things that I wanted the book to have built into it, as well as it being a kind of a serious investigation into what it is to be a survivor.
Around her, the world is collapsing, as losing any moral sense. How does she figure things out? She trusts her instinct. She has a very limited knowledge of life, because not only is she a child, but she is also a young woman. So threats are many around her. She's always in danger.
Yeah, I mean, at one point on her journey, she gets a job working on a famine road, because there was assistance to build roads through mountains to the middle of nowhere, through boglands, for the purpose of for basically paying people who needed aid. But she's dressed as a boy, and it's getting more and more problematic, this dress as a boy, because she's becoming a young woman, and she has her period on this this construction site, and she's like, unfortunately she can't hide it. It happens. She's sitting on a rock, and she gets up, and they all clock that they have a boy in their a girl in her midst, and everything suddenly changed. The way they treat her, the way they look at her. She starts measuring. One of the guys on the site starts looking at her, and she starts measuring the weight of his look in pounds and ounces or something, whatever. And so suddenly it actually starts getting dangerous then for her, because of course she becomes objectified then, and again she manages to get into a situation that she gets out of, and that's thanks to Bart, who comes to her aid, and that begins this long sequence in the novel where they start to understand what's truly unfolding. And Bart has this moment where he faces down horse and carriages on a road. He just stands and faces them down, and they come bearing down on him, and he's almost killed. He gets kicked into a ditch, and she's like, "What are you doing?" And he stands up and he says, "Either I face them down, or we die, you know. And he has this moment where he says, we need to be our own gods now, because there is nothing. There is this, you know, the gap between what they are and what the rest of the world is just so enormous. He understands that unless you truly become activated in the most, you know, they become criminals, and so that begins the descent then into immorality and, you know, and the deeper trouble that happens.
And going on this journey with her, did you learn anything from trials? Were you aware of what this journey was going to be for her, or you discovered and you experienced it along with her?
Well, there's a kind of, you know, when you're writing a book, for me anyway, it's really a case of like the map and the territory. When I begin a book, I have a sense of the book schematically. I have these. It usually begins with, I have these images, and they sort of resonate, and the images have been handed to me from my subconscious somewhere, and I don't know what they mean. So I have to. The writing is what is unpacking these images, these coded images, and so I see these images in the book, and it's usually somewhat schematic. And I always know the ending, and I know the feeling of the ending, and there's certain points, but that's the map. The territory is completely different, and very often I don't quite know what's unfolding. I don't know what's going to happen next, and so I'm guided by the language. I'm guided by what my character wants. You know, I always ask myself the question: well, like, what does she need? What does she need right now? And that often leads you to the next thing. And so there were some things that were some very strange discoveries. So there's a moment. I'm not going to ruin it, but she has to pull the body of an old woman out of a house, and she starts having dreams about this old woman coming at her, this kind of witchy granny, and it's a very strange sequence. And I wrote that, and I was quite surprised when it came out, and then I read sometime after that in some Jungian analysis that this is actually a very frequent dream that women have about wrestling with sort of witchy grannies, these old witchy grannies in dreams, and that it's almost an archetypal dream that many women have reported having. And this is a dream that she has when she's in this house. It happens to her 3 times, and I just didn't know that. So I was quite astonished by that glorious coincidence. But so you just discover all these strange things, but very often it's Grace. Is you know, she's this. I just felt her on the page as this enormous character, this great life force, and I just, you know, I followed her. You know, she's my character, but I follow her and to see where she goes.
She faces destruction. She faces death. It is like she's, you know, going to crossing hell, going to hell. Was your writing inspired by or influenced by any fear you had? How did you face yourself as the author? All the ugly things she meets, you know, all the terrible moments she has to go through. Were you completely exterior to that, or were you, on the contrary, part of it?
I would say that I was a part of a lot of it. I mean, if the reader feels the emotion of the writing, that's because I felt the emotion of the writing, and I have to feel it so that I can communicate what Grace feels. And a lot of there are times in the book when the events took me to places that made me uncomfortable as a writer.
For example,
Well, there's the sequence before the black pages. There's 4 black pages in this book where the writing stops, and that sequence leading up to that was a very powerful experience for me writing it, and very I won't say dangerous, but you're staring into into darkness. You're staring into the abyss when you're writing this stuff. You're staring at the darkest things, and there's sometimes a danger that you can fall in. And I remember when I was writing The Black Snow, my second novel, I felt on the verge of falling in for a while, genuinely. And I remember that. I remember very well going, I need to be careful here. And it happens. It does happen to writers that you can tip over. You see into the darkness and you can't come back out. But the thing is the book asked of me to go there, and I have to, as a writer, respect the truth of that. I have to respect the truth of the events, that the truth of the story, and that if I back away from that, then the book is no longer truthful. And also then, I'm no longer doing what it was I sought to do, which was to bring a light to a particular area of the family that I felt had not been covered before by fiction, which is the psychological cost of such an event. To truly enter into somebody and to measure that experience. I felt that had not been done, and I know that there is lots of literature that's dealt with that. Like, for example, the Shoah Holocaust literature has really confronted that stuff, and I think it's very important that we do. And so, I felt at times sort of an instinct to back away. And whenever I felt that instinct, it was like, that meant I had to go in further. And so I went in all the way. And the book gets to a point where Grace and Bart are basically succumbing to the winter of 46, 47, what we call Black 47, that second winter that really decimated the country. And up until this point, they've been convinced that they are unbeatable, that they are their own gods, and that they will get through this. But the event is of such a scale that it draws them in, and they start to unravel, and they start to, almost lose their minds with hunger, and so the language starts to change. So the realism in the novel that's held up to this point starts to come off the register, because the language of realism can no longer hold, because the psychological experience is no longer rooted to the real, and so the language starts to slip. And there's a moment in the book, in a section called Crow, where Grace completely dissociates, and the language moves into the magical, into a kind of a fantasy. And as the story continues, the language starts to fragment. It starts to just come apart, because the words cannot meet what's been met. And then we meet just 4 black pages, where the words reach an end point, and language can no longer enter into what has been met. And also, those 4 pages are, in many ways, the silence, the things that we just can't know.
And were you thinking then of other moments in history when human beings face the apocalypse, the end of the world, the end of life, which can only be met with silence? Was this something conscious that Grace's experience was resonating with other experiences elsewhere through history and maybe through modern times?
I mean, yes, but I wasn't sort of. My head is full of books, so it's books are built on books, and my head is full of the books that I've read, and I've read a lot of books that I've read a lot of the great literature that confronts these things, and so I've absorbed that, and that's inescapable. And then there's the mythology that creeps in as well. Like Dante was inescapable, and so inescapable that that when Grace is taken across to Swilly, Loch Swilly, in a boat by a character called Charlie, which sounds, in my mind, it was like Sharon. He's been taken across it, and that's because that's the start. That's the start of the underworld. And so one of the reasons that Collie needed to come back was because I needed a Virgil, and he kind of becomes, her guide in his own way, of course. But so that was in my mind a lot, writing this book. And other, Irish mythology as well, because Grace interprets her life through the myths and legends that she's grown up with. The various stories of characters who can't get back home or can't get off the horse to touch the ground or whatever, and they're lost for 300 years, and all these things resonate very deeply, because all she wants to do is to get back to Black Mountain, and all the events of the novel seems designed completely to frustrate that at all times.
And can we say that nature and landscape are both a full character in the book?
Yeah, of course. You know, I, I love writing about nature, landscape, the sky. Someone once said to me, "Why is there so much bloody rain and skies in your books?" And I'm saying, like, well, have you looked up? Sometimes I think that we seem to forget that the vault above us exists at all, and these are fundamentals, and they're a silence that frames us. This is what I find interesting, is that nature is silent. We create our own meaning, we create our own morals. Time passes by silently, nature passes by silently. The landscape, deep geological time is always there, reminding us of how short our lives are. And so that's very important for me, that these nature's always framing our sense of the of the condition of the characters. And also there is just the fact that it's a part of the world that she's in, and it's my job as a novelist to make you see and feel and smell that world as best I can. That I present images to you, and I want to chisel them to such a point that you can just seize them off the page. Because my job is to try and make the world new for you as a reader. It's to sort of wake you up out of complacency, and the complacency that we all have in looking at the world, and to see things as if you've not seen it before. And so I'm always trying to find new ways of describing the obvious, so that each moment passes as if it's been deeply felt, as if it's been deeply experienced. And I've been helped, because over the years I've been meditating for 12, 13 years now, I think, at this point. And that what that does is it sort of just wakes you up a little bit. You sort of start looking at the world a bit more precisely. Sometimes you just start looking at things in a way that I certainly didn't look at before. And it's not a mystic experience. It's just a way of looking, and I find that to be immensely helpful in my writing. If I can make people read my books and make them feel in some way like children again, experiencing the world for the first time, then I'm very pleased. That's my secret goal.
When you first started writing the novel, were you already aware of its course? Did you know everything about her journey, or did you discover things taking the journey with her?
Yeah, no, as I was saying, like that, it's always a case of discovery. But there's an epigraph at the start of the book by T.S. Eliot from Song of Solomon. My life is light. My life is like waiting for the death wind, like a feather on the back of my hand, and that line was in my head from the beginning, and that was what I was writing towards. The very last line of the book, which is about light, which is about Grace's spiritual arc, her kind of the raising of her consciousness. So that was always guiding me, that I would take her down into a very dark place, test her, and allow her to come back out of that with wisdom and knowing, because that's you have to know the darkness to become wise. And the book takes her back out of hell, back into the light. And so this line from Eliot was present for me right from the beginning. And so I knew the last line pretty much from writing the first sentence, even though I didn't quite know what the book was really going to be. I just had that feeling, and I knew what it would be.
You said earlier to journalists, a French journalist, that you, at the time, before even being aware of writing this novel, you were reading a book about the famine in China. Um, and I know that there were not direct testimonies of the Irish famine. What was the most striking for you when you read those books about the Chinese famine? What was um, the most strong feeling you had?
Yeah. So as we were saying that when I realized that I would have to write a famine novel, and I decided I didn't want to write it. At the same time, going back over a period of months, I had been reading all about Mao's famine in China. And what had happened was the archives had been opened, and historians had been allowed to have access to this. And the archives were extraordinary. That Mao's famine killed 35 million people in three to 4 years. Entirely man-made famine, and it occurred in a totalitarian communist system. So everything was recorded, nothing was missed, and the archives revealed the true horrors, but all recorded. So, for example, the one thing that's essentially missing from the Irish story is cannibalism, and it occurred to a horrific degree in China. Of course it did, because cannibalism occurs in famines. And in the other two massive communist-caused famines in the 20th century, one was Ukraine, and the other one, I'm so tired I can't remember. Someone will probably tell me what that was. But cannibalism again was so rife that the authorities actually printed off posters saying, it's don't be eating your children, essentially. And so it's always struck me as strange that this was missing from the Irish story. And of course, famines bring about we default. We go back to the animal, the shadow. We do the things that we need to do to survive. So I think it's almost incredibly naive to think that there was no cannibalism during the Irish famine. And so this was one of the things that I realized, one of the taboos that I was going to take on. Because also, if you look at just looking at the historical record, criminality went through the ceiling during that period. Of course it did. I mean, and so this is what was there in Mao's famine was just the scale of criminality, the scale of what people really get up to, and it's all recorded during the 20th century. Beautiful if you're a writer, and so I realized. This takes me to realizing something about myself as a writer, was that I had no idea I was going to write a famine novel, and yet there I was researching a famine novel. So this is the problem, which is that writing has nothing to do with the front of your brain. The rational part that thinks it's in charge, that thinks it's making decisions, that has ideas about yourself. That's all rubbish. Any artist will tell you it's all about the subconscious. And writing is really just figuring out a way of somehow opening that door and listening to what's been prompted. And it's like when you dream and you get these. We all wake up from a dream that seems to be particularly meaningful. It's coded with meaning, and we're trying to figure out, why do I feel so moved by this dream, and it haunts us all day long, and it keeps resonating. And sometimes we go, and then we realize what the dream's really about. Fiction, the writing of fiction, or all art, I would presume, is much the same thing, that you just have these strange promptings, and you have to figure out what the hell they mean. And so you have to open the door and somehow get that subconscious into your language, and then you figure out what's happening. But also, the subconscious just seems to know anyway what it is you're going to be doing. So, like, my subconscious seemed to know completely clearly that I was going to be writing a book about the famine. That's why it had me doing some research without me knowing it was research. It seemed to know that, Grace was going to be this character in this book, and that's why what I've learned about writing after all these years is I'm not in charge. Just some other part of my brain back there that I can't see is directing me, and so I'm just the puppet here talking to you now about something that I have no control over.
Have you been frightened at times? And what have you learned ultimately? Because I guess it must not be very easy to go back to real life, daily life, when you've spent hours, with this young girl.
I'm usually very happy to go back to real life. When I write very intensely, and so I'm pretty exhausted when I'm done. I kind of write. I start writing 2 sessions. I usually get up very early because I have a young family, and so we have a 3.5-year-old girl and a 4-month-old baby. So not what I would call optimum writing conditions. So what I do is I get up early, and I meditate for a while, and then I write. And so writing is generally two spells for me. But I won't describe it as a trance state because it's not a trance state, but it's like meditating. I go into a place. It's what psychologists call flow. Yes, what you try to get, where you just you disappear, you lose yourself, and you just enter into the world. You enter into the language, and you can disappear for an hour and a half, and you're gone. And then you just start to come back out, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm back again. And some days it's not like that at all. Some days it's just like bloody hammering granite, and you're getting absolutely nowhere. But on the best days, that's what it's like. And so I would aim to try and get 2 writing sessions like that. But by the end of it, I'm completely exhausted. And there are some days I'm so tired by it, I can't even read fiction for the rest of the day. I'm just picking up a book and reading it. It's an easy thing to do. I'm just too tired to do it. And so then life takes over, of course. And there's shopping. I do all the shopping, cook all the food, and bills and fucking emails and usual stuff. And that's my life.
Did you go on the fast to experience what it is?
Nah, I just made it up. No, I mean, you have to trust that your imagination can go to these places without having to experience them yourselves, which makes me think of 2 stories. One was Ian McEwan researching an autopsy, and he wrote the scene, and he was delighted with it, and then he realized that he made it all up, so he decided to do some serious research, and he went and he got access and watched some real autopsies and took serious notes, and then he went away and rewrote a whole new scene based on the real, and then he realized he hated it and that it was crap fiction, and he went back to what he'd done in the first place. And that's the thing, is that this strange truth emerges from the stuff you make up. Then, of course, there's the famous anecdote. Was it Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman? Someone will tell me the film, because again, I'm so tired I can't remember it. But the Hoffman was that Marathon Man, brilliant. And Hoffman had been, keeping himself awake for 24 hours and probably fasting, and was half demented on the set. And Olivier looks at him and he goes, "Why don't you try acting?"
But ultimately, the book, for all its darkness and difficulties, is also a book about the triumph of life, because Grace survives, we can say it. And
she has to survive.
She has to survive. She is a survivor, and everything she went through deeply changed her.
One of the things that was important in a book like this is conveying that life goes on, that people survive, that they somehow learn to live with this event inside them, and to do that, I think, requires something that goes unspoken among a lot of people who are survivors. I think they're people who have, they're deeply enlightened. I think they've seen things that most of us just can't imagine how we'd cope with it. And for me, Grace is genuinely transcendent when she reaches the end of this book. That she has, thank you, Elliot. She's gone down into the full depths of hell and come back out. She's come back out but through a miracle, in fact, because I'm not going to ruin how she is rescued at a point when she's beyond her own powers of help anymore, and she's rescued, and it's a miracle for her in some respects. It's a figurative miracle for the person who needs to create a miracle to rescue her, and she ends up in a cult, a millennialist cult, an end of days cult. And I had this feeling when I was writing the book that end of days cults would have existed at this time. Millennialism would have been rife, because the general thought at the time among the ordinary people was that this was providence, this was the fist of God coming down on their heads, that they didn't look at the event the way we would look at it now. And so millennialism would have been rife. And I emailed a famine expert about this, and he said, yeah. So I was like, good. So I went and created my own thing. And one of the things that I wanted to do with this was, after the famine, the Irish flocked towards the Catholic Church. The grip of the Church in Ireland occurred pretty much after the famine. That we flocked to the priesthood and the nunneries, and the congregations just filled up. And I wanted to convey that sense of the rush to religion, that end of days feeling. And so Grace enters this cult that's full of all sorts of dubious things going on. But I wanted to mirror in some way what's happened with the church in Ireland. But it seemed too obvious to do the church. And so this was nice, that I was able to sort of evoke the religious aspect of what happened. And so Grace becomes deeply religious for a period of time. And then she moves beyond it. And so I had this secret wish in the book that not only was there an arc of a raising of her consciousness, this arc of development for her from childhood to adolescence, and from the lowest point of the human psyche to perhaps one of the highest, kind of almost enlightenment, that also I'd have this little secret kind of spiritual arc of Ireland through the book, this kind of pagan, a la carte Christian land that we were before the famine, and then into this intense, almost theocratic grip, and then out again into this kind of more secular place. And so Grace has to escape, get out from the cult, and she moves beyond that.
And to be nice with her, could we end this conversation with a passage toward the end of the book, when she's in the light again? She went through everything, and her success is the victory of life upon death.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the thing: is life continues, and people have to live again. But I haven't a clue what I'm going to read, because you've just sprung this on me. I haven't looked at these back pages now in a few years. I will. Let me see. I'll just read a short passage here now, and I'm going to stop at a certain point. In the days that follow, she begins to feel a shift inside her, as if a great light were shining through her, a light reaching into dark. Thought like rain washing through sky, like glass that holds the world without discolor, like sunlight passing beauty through water, like sunlight passing through wind beneath the rising wing beat. The child soon due, and these are the good blue days, and she knows, yes, I will speak. The words will come, and I will speak of what is now, of only this. And I will stop there, because I don't want to ruin the last sequence.